All right, there we go. So at the end of the self-exploration activity, I asked everyone to consider these questions based on the answers you gave to passions, strengths, and problems that break your heart. The first question was, where might we find confidence and connection between these areas? This is a question that basically asks, like, a lot of my students from my community engagement class said they didn't feel confident going into an area that they didn't have expertise in, that they didn't particularly have experiences in. And in the empathy stage, we talked a lot about this, like how to approach a situation, how to become a part of a community, how to ask the right kind of questions. And those are all things that will help you feel more confident engaging, even if you're not the expert in the situation. And that's fine. Like, all of our conversation has been around just accepting that we are going to be beginners in a situation. So the question was, where do you feel confident in? Like, which area would you feel confidence in based on your passions and strengths? Where would you feel needed? Where would your strengths be most useful? In which problem area? And where do you see a connection that ties you personally to the situation? So that was sort of the reason of the impact focus. And I think everybody did a really great job. And sometimes, for example, Grayson's example came from a place of personal connection, same for Laquanda versus like Madhavan and Susan, it's more of a broader scope, same goes for me, and that's okay. Sometimes the connection comes from personal experience, sometimes it comes from a place of concern, place of like seeing it and reflecting on it, and that's also fine. I just wanted you all to reflect on what's your connection to this problem that breaks your heart. And the rest of the questions are sort of similar to that. By impact focus, I did mean like the problem area you want to focus on, but from what perspective do we want to approach it? Like, for instance, for Grayson and Laquanda, you both want to focus around LGBTQ communities, but you two have different approaches based on different problems you want to solve. Similar thing could be said for like, for instance, Susan's problems were also broader. And let's take environmental issues at hand. There's millions of ways you can start making an impact in the environmental focus, like environmental issues area. But based on what Susan said, let's say she said she was creative, she loves collages, drawing, etc. She could take an approach, like her impact focus could focus on artistic causes to solve climate change versus, let's say I'm very interested in environmental issues, but my strength is working with children. I can focus, like take more of an educational perspective, work with kindergartners, etc. So by impact focus, I meant what's the sort of, like where are you positioned? Remember the positionality conversation. Where are you positioned and what would be the approach you want to take into this big issue that you're wanting to solve? So think about the communities, the audiences, your perspective on things, and that was the impact focus. And feel free to reflect on this because we're going to continue building on this more and more as we continue. Before I talk about what stakeholder mapping is, I want to talk about the connections between all of these stuff we've been doing in class. I don't know if you guys feel like that, but this is actually about a semester's worth of like conversations and content if this was a 1 or 2 credit class. So we actually covered a lot. I've done half of these in my community engagement classes. Half of them are things we're hoping to implement in the advanced seminars. So you got this whole big crash course with like a bunch of stuff so far, and we're still going. So I wanted to take a moment and talk about the connections between these stuff. We did the shoe design experiment. We did the design thinking mindsets. You got like an overview of what design thinking is. So I want to take the moment to talk about the first 2 steps. This is the 5 stages of design thinking. You've seen the videos. We've gone through them in the shoe design experiment. The stages are empathy, define or reframe, ideate, prototype, and test. And overall, they make what we call the design thinking methodology, which is basically a structure for creative problem solving. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of applying your thoughts and reflections to creatively solve a problem, to take us outside of the box and to ideate and figure out what's the best way to approach solving this problem. So far, we focused a lot on empathy, which is the problem space itself, like what is the problem we want to solve? What are the communities around this problem? Because this course is not just about solving a problem, ideating, prototyping, etc., which are all tools we can use, but we are also focusing on community engagement and how to take this methodology and actually apply it in a way that is most beneficial for communities, for community engagement, for you to actually make human connections. So so far, we focused a lot on empathy. I've been listing the activities at the bottom of the slides on like what activities did we do and what steps of the design thinking process they relate to. You'll see a lot of them are on empathy. Our active listening, principle of community engagement, the documentary, the TED Talk, and empathy mapping, which we're gonna do after this stage. They're all around empathy, which is basically, it explains here, centerpiece of a human-centered design process. The empathy stage encompasses the work you do to understand people within the context of your design challenge. In this case, we're not doing a design challenge. We're not doing anything product-based. We're doing something around the problem that breaks your heart. So you can change that word however you like based on the context you're using design thinking for. So it's your effort to understand, like what empathy is your effort to understand the way the community do things and why, their physical and emotional needs, how they think about the world, and what is meaningful to them. And this is the time we spent most on, has been on this step. So the second step, which we're sort of dabbling in now, is reframing and defining. So I wanted everyone to take a moment, think about their impact focus, basically turn the empathy stage to yourself and explore what you want out of a community engaged situation, or what you want out of finding a solution or designing something. So that's what we've been doing so far. And the impact focus, I think, sort of relates to the define stage, which is the second stage of design thinking, where you, this is about bringing clarity and focus to the design space. It's your chance and responsibility as a design thinker to define the challenge you're taking on based on what you've learned about your user and about the context. So we're doing this a bit on the flip side. We have discovered the space, like the problem space, and now with stakeholder mapping, with empathy mapping, with the rest of the 5 sessions we have, we're going to do exactly what they're saying here. Based on what you've learned about your user and about the context, we're going to learn about how to explore user needs, which we've been doing so far, but also a bit more about the context and how to frame that in a way that will push you towards a solution. So it says, after gaining invaluable empathy for the person you're designing for, in which case we're talking about community engagement, it's not a user. This stage is about making sense of the widespread information you've gathered. So an example could be, when I ask you guys to do stakeholder mapping, you're going to list all of the people that are impacted by a situation. Let's take into consideration LGBTQ community or trans community in Rochester, and we are going to think about what does lack of space for LGBTQ community in Rochester, who does it impact, how, what kind of communities does it influence, not just the LGBTQ community, but let's say their parents, their friends, other people who are prejudiced about the situation. They don't get the experience to talk with these people and experience what it means to be LGBTQ, and therefore have different opinions. So we're going to list all of these steps. So we're going to really explore the communities that you want to work with. And that's going to be a part of defining. We're going to define the communities you want to work with. And from there on, we're going to start building up towards a solution. So this is the second stage. And the activities are stakeholder mapping and empathy mapping. So today and Friday, our activities will be on stage 2. So a lot of this course, which was intentional, the first 6 sessions or so have been on empathy. This next 2 sessions will be on reframe. And next week will be entirely on ideation, testing, and prototyping. So we're moving forward in the design thinking stages now. Any questions, comments, anything so far you want to say about the empathy experience, any feedback? Everybody feeling good about what we've covered so far? Thumbs up, down, sideways? Good, okay, I'm glad to hear. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce this tool called Stakeholder Mapping. and then you will be tasked to complete one for the impact focus that you've chosen or for the problem that breaks your heart, however you want to phrase it. So far, like I mentioned, we did some tools like active listening, we did some methodologies, we did like introduction to design thinking. So now I'm going to introduce another tool, which is called Stakeholder Mapping. Basically, this is a collaborative process of identifying a list of key people within the community or communities you want to engage with and organizing them into groups to make sense of them. So remember when we were talking about principles of community engagement, and Elena and Bertha talked about, that was not the, I'm mixing up the presentations, but the first group talked about how to define a community, the systems perspective, individual perspective, etc. So here, this is where it comes handy as well. So we're again talking about identifying communities we want to engage with, because it's important to know who you want to engage with so you don't leave out anyone or you don't accidentally miss an entire portion of the problem. So a stakeholder is any person or organization that has an interest or influence in what you want to achieve. This is how I defined everybody in this class. We are all stakeholders. We make up a community together. Once you identify your focus or intended impact outcome, which is the impact focused conversation we had where all of you just shared the problem area, the problem space you want to work on, this is basically what we're going to do now. It's useful to think about who might be useful to engage with to support your community-led change efforts. So we're going to think about who's impacted by the problem area that you picked, what communities revolve around that problem area, who is influencing the situation, who's influenced by the situation, and who has a direct relationship with the problem or who has an indirect impact resulting from the problem. So we're going to think about some of these stuff. That's what stakeholder mapping is. Basically, there are 4 main stages. The first one is identifying, listing the relevant groups, organizations, and people who will have an interest in or connection to the outcome or purpose you're interested in. So for some of you, it was more of a outcome-related impact focus. Like for instance, Madhavan's impact focus, he mentioned one of them was teaching STEM for minorities. And that's more of an outcome-focused impact focus versus for Grayson, it was more of a like broader area. It was about like perception of this medication to prevent exposure to HIV/AIDS. And that's more of a, like there's less of an outcome. It's not like teach this or do this, but it's about more of an area. Same goes like Laquanda mentioned creating spaces versus Susan mentioned like environmental issues, more broader scope. And all of those are fine. Those of you that have a narrower scope will have an easier time with the identifying step because you already have something in mind. So for those of you that mentioned something broader, like I mentioned fascism, huge subject, everybody in the world gets impacted. So I would urge those that have a broader scope to take time in the identifying step and first narrow down either demographically or geographically. So instead of saying fascism in the world, I want to solve it, that's insane, huge problem, that would overwhelm me. I would rather say, I'm going to work with youth in Istanbul to figure out how they're impacted by fascism and what we might do as the youth to figure out this problem. Or I'm going to give the example. I was going to text Bertha after this as well. Bertha mentioned she doesn't like conflict and she would like to perhaps do something about that. There's the Gandhi Institute in Rochester that works in nonviolent communication practices and with youth on how to do peace education, basically. So that could be your impact focus, like how to do nonviolent communication, something like that. So this is going to look different for all of you, and that's fine. But if you want to narrow down to make sense of your audience or the communities, narrow down geographically, demographically, age range, sex, gender, whatever you want to narrow down with. But all of those demographics would help you make more sense of the identifying step. So the second step is analyzing, going deeper to understand stakeholder perspectives and interests. This can be done informally, brainstorming conversations, or more formally, surveys, structures, meeting, engagement processes. This is the step basically gets you to think about who are these communities, what are some of their biggest challenges, what are some of their biggest thoughts and feelings, and this is exactly what the empathy mapping will do after this as well, to give you another tool to do this more in-depthly. I'll introduce that much later, so that's okay. The third stage is mapping. You identified all the stakeholders, people, organizations, communities, groups, etc. You sort of understand where they stand surrounding the issue, whether they're impacted or they make an impact, whether they have a positive or negative influence, whether they're directly or indirectly influenced, all that stuff. And now you map them. This can be a mind map, this can be a list, this can be a drawing, whatever you want to do. Sort of visualize how people and communities fit each other around your impact focus. And then lastly, prioritize ranking stakeholder connections and interests to help work out who to engage or involve and how or how deeply. So the question here is, if you were to go out and talk to one of these people to understand the problem better, who would be the first person you go to? That's basically the prioritization step. How's everybody doing? Any questions you have so far? Okay, I'm gonna keep going then. Oh, okay, 1 second. Okay, so do you see how the stakeholder mapping sort of fits within our theme of exploring and identifying communities? I guess I'm just gonna go thumbs up, sideways, down to sort of get feedback from all of you. Okay, that's good. Mapping, okay. Mapping is just basically, I got a question about mapping. So mapping is just basically visualizing how these different communities or groups may fit together. And this is just for your own use. Most of the people do like word maps or mind maps, like bubbles, and then they connect them to each other, that kind of stuff. I had students do like lists, but they drew connections between people, just sort of like a visual that would help you make sense of how these communities interact with each other. So I'm going to talk about the to-do because you're going to do a stakeholder map based on the impact focuses you shared today in our meeting. But of course, you won't just go do it. I already have a similar presentation to the self-exploration activity. I have a PowerPoint slide deck that you can follow the instructions step by step to complete these 4 stages. And before you do that, there are 2 really short, neither of them are 5 minutes long, like readings, like 2 short articles. One of them is very much similar to what we are doing. Basically how I describe stakeholder mapping is more about community engagement. And the other one is more about how to use stakeholder mapping in businesses, ventures, entrepreneurship, etc. I just wanted you to see the 2 sides of how a tool like stakeholder mapping could be used. So I would say first, go and check those articles out. And then 2, I'll share the link for the presentation you should follow the steps for to make your own stakeholder map. Then you should make your own stakeholder map. And that activity should take about 30 to 40 minutes. So it won't be as long as a self-exploration activity. This is the first time you're not running over time. That's pretty much all I had to say. So if you guys have any questions about the design thinking process, how you see these things fitting together, or if you have any questions about stakeholder mapping before you start, feel free to shout them out. We still have like 8 minutes before class ends.
So then if you want us to make our own stakeholder mapping based on our choices, like our passions, our problems, and our, okay.
Yes, exactly. I would love for you all to try out how to make the stakeholder map. Obviously, you don't have to stick with this after this course is done. Like, I just want to introduce the tool and give you a sense of practice based on the stuff you already figured out, based on the self-exploration activity, so that if you want to use this in the future for anything, you know how to use the tool. So I'll share the instructions. I have a step-by-step PowerPoint, and you can follow that and make your stakeholder map for Friday's class. Also, bit of a more logistical announcement. We basically have Friday and the next week 3 more sessions. So we have 4 sessions left. And I would appreciate if all of you could be there for all of them. The people who are here, you haven't really missed any of the sessions, which is great. I'm going to contact the other people as well. We need you to be at these classes or complete the activities if you miss them to be able to give you a certificate at the end. And I don't think any of you that are here right now should be concerned about that because you've made it to everything. But if you need to miss anything, please let me know because it's hard to plan if I don't know how many people are going to be here. So we just have 1 more week left, and I'm going to share out some resources on how you can keep going with design thinking or community engagement stuff, especially in UFR, so that you know how you might want to take this further as well. But that's just logistical. For purposes of Friday, read the articles and do the stakeholder map, and that should be great. Any other comments or feedback? Okay, look at that. People have time to go to the bathroom before Rob's class starts. All right, I'm gonna put the exit ticket prompt in the exit ticket link in the Slack. Since we have 5 minutes, please complete it and I'll see you on Friday. Thank you, everybody.